Welcome back, Daisy Cakes. Today I want to talk about Brandon Sanderson's novel, Wind and Truth, the last volume in the first arc of the Stormlight Archives. Why? Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I've been seeing a fair few videos about Wind and Truth, and at least judging by the thumbnails, it hasn't been getting stellar reviews. I personally liked Wind and Truth, so I guess my opinion is a little contrary. What else is new? But I can see why some people may not have liked it at least as much as his other books, which I think has to do with Brandon Sanderson's structured way of writing. So I want to talk about two things that contributed, in my opinion, to some potential frustration with this final book in this story arc. The first is point of view, and the second is character arcs. Backing up a bit, I felt the same frustration when I first started reading Wind and Truth, but then I let go of trying to read the book like his other books and let go of my expectations of what the reading experience should have been and just slowed down. Yes, I slowed down and leisurely read Wind and Truth over almost a 2-month period, or maybe it was like 6 weeks, but it was a lot longer than what I usually took to read one book, even a big book. Most of the time I reach what I call the point of no return, where I get so invested in the story and the pacing gets so compelling that I can't put the book down. And that's what I usually get when I read Brandon Sanderson, and that's what I was expecting in Wind and Truth. And to be fair, there were a few times where I got to a point where I felt like I couldn't put the book down. I kept reading and reading, but then the pacing would hit a wall and I would have to pull back. Now, I have a suspicion that maybe some booktubers or reviewers tried to read Wind and Truth as fast as possible to be the first to get a review up, and I kind of started like that too, until I realized this is a different type of reading experience and slowed down. And once I slowed down, I enjoyed the story much more. But why was this a different reading experience from his other books? Once again, character arcs and point of view, and they go hand in hand. But let's take a look at character arcs first. Sanderson and almost all writers have their characters grow and change through the story. Like Merry and Pippin were a couple of silly hobbits who didn't take anything seriously at the start of leaving Hobbiton, but then when they returned to Hobbiton, after everything happened, they were these warrior heroes. So that's what I mean by character arc. Now, not all stories are the same. Some stories, like detective stories, the main character, the detective, doesn't really grow and change like Hercule Poirot. And in some stories, the character arcs, like American Psycho, has the character descend into madness. It's almost a negative character arc. Poppy Wars also does that. And then there are flat character arcs where the character ends up in the same place he or she started. Read Jean-Paul Sartre or any existentialist. But Sanderson likes a full transformative character arc where the character starts off flawed, usually really flawed, and then through the course of the story, recognize their flaws, come to terms with it, and then grow or self-actualize and end up in a much better place. That's usually Sanderson's MO. Like, Kaladin starts off as this bitter, vengeful man who turns his back on healing to become a killing machine, and his anger gets tempered through the Bridge 4 storyline, and he finds empathy with the Bridge 4 crew, but then it's set back by suffering from PTSD from all the combat, and now has to find a new role and relevance. Sanderson also likes to give character arcs to his villains, and all of this is great. It has worked out fantastically in all his other books. We love a good transformative character arcs. But there are a lot of characters. Over the last 4 books, there are so many interesting characters added that they just begin to pile up. And in Wind and Truth, here's where we get the resolution to all of their stories. And the novel is broken up over a 10-day period. So there are 10 parts, each part being like 100 to 150 pages. And at the start, we see whose point of view is going to be in each part. So let's take a look at the last part, part 10. We have Dalinar, Adolin, Seth, Kaladin, Shallan, Navani, Renarin, R'lain, Yanagon, Mraize, Venli, Nael, Silfrena, Taravangian, Sigzil, Janna, and Wit. And that's 17. 17 characters. Now, if you know anything about storytelling, when we reach the climax, our main character goes through what is termed the dark night of the soul, where things are at their very worst, and the character doubts everything that they have learned up to this point. They doubt themselves, and it feels like there is no hope. Guess what we get in Wind of Truth? 17, at least, Dark Nights of the Soul. Maybe I exaggerate a bit, but not by much. And that's a big reason why I couldn't read this as fast as I normally would, because it was just so emotionally and mentally exhausting. When Sanderson does A Dark Night, he really goes into a lot of internal thoughts and feelings and struggles of the characters. He delves really deep, really gets them to hurt and confront uncomfortable truths, and it can be a lot. Now, in other novels, usually there's just one main character, and once you reach that dark night, you know that things are going to turn around once we reach the climax. But in epic fantasy, when there are so many main characters, and the author wants to wrap everything up in one book, then each character who gets a transformational character arc is going to go through one of these really dark times. And it's not fun to read a bunch of these dark nights back to back. So the solution is, don't do it. Put the book down. When you reach a point where a character really suffers, step away from the book, because chances are another character is going to go through the same thing, and it can be a lot when you read them back to back. Take a break, come back to the story later. At least that worked for me. What Sanderson could have done is do a George R.R. Martin and kill off half the characters so he wouldn't have so many at the end. But who would he have gotten rid of? Kaladin? Shallan? Jasnah? But he didn't do any of that. I know I would have gotten upset if he got rid of either Shallan or Dalinar. Sanderson made the choice to keep all of these characters, so we're going to have to go through all of these Dark Nights of the Soul all in one book. So take your time reading Wind and Truth. You don't have to read it in 1 week. Take a month. Take 2 months. Pace yourself. The other reason this felt longer than normal, when we went through each of these character arcs, it kind of had to be a deep dive because Sanderson writes in the limited third-person point of view. Briefly, going over points of view. There's first person, which everyone knows. The entire story is told from one character's viewpoint as though they are telling you the story. There's second person, which you almost never see. It's either a choose-your-own-adventure book or some sort of experimental writing. Then there's third person. Third person is either limited or omniscient. Sanderson writes third person limited, where the reader only is told what the character is feeling. In other words, the prose is limited to that character's point of view. It's kind of like first person, but it gives a little bit more flexibility. Then there's omniscient third person, which I really like, but it's almost never used anymore. You hardly ever see it these days. I'll say 90% of fiction now is either first person or third person limited. Can there be a first person omniscient? The only time I've ever sort of seen it is in Case and Callender's Queen of the Conquered, where the main character is psychic and could tell what everyone around her is thinking and feeling. But third-person omniscient is what Lord of the Rings point of view is written as. And then Lord of the Rings is the template for all epic fantasy. And there are a lot of characters in Lord of the Rings. I mean, we start off with the Fellowship, which is 9 characters, still a lot less than Stormlight, and one of those 9 dies, and one is presumed dead for a while. But when we get to the end, in Return of the King, it's pretty much those characters that we follow. And because the writing is omniscient, we can get insights into all of them at any time. It's not super detailed or a deep dive like Third Person Limited, but it's enough that we know what's going on. Lord of the Rings, the entire trilogy, is about as long as Wind and Truth, but Lord of the Rings contains the entire story. The climax, the conclusion, is all, of course, in Return of the King. Now, if Lord of the Rings was written in Third Person Limited, we would have gotten a chapter from Frodo's point of view, a chapter from Sam's point of view, a chapter from Gollum's point of view, and we would have alternated among them all through their journey to Mount Doom. Now imagine on top of that, we got chapters for each of the others, Pippin and Merry, Gandalf, Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas. Return of the King would have gone on at least 3 times as long as it did. And we would have been exhausted by the end. But in Omniscient, in one chapter we know that Frodo is exhausted and on his last legs. We know that Sam loves Frodo so much that it's killing Sam to see Frodo struggle. And we know that Gollum is torn between wanting the ring and finding that he actually kind of likes Frodo. Omniscient allows us to see all of that without having to separate each point of view into separate chapters. That's why I think some people may have had trouble reading Wind and Truth. There were just so many characters, and we had to wrap their story arcs up in this one book, which meant that we had to do deep dives into each of their dark nights of the soul. And Sanderson really didn't have any choice because it was written in limited third person, but to devote chapters to each of them, going through what they went through, at least if we wanted the characters to have satisfying conclusions to their character arcs. Yes, I did say that Sanderson really had no choice because that's how the story is structured and set up. Again, I enjoyed the book, but I also took time to read it. I took breaks, a lot of breaks, so I wasn't exhausted from what felt to me like back-to-back torturing of characters, 17 viewpoint characters. Just take your time. There's no rush. I think you'll have a better reading experience. Now, do I think this is the best book of the series? No. I may still put it at the bottom, but I still enjoyed seeing how the story concludes. What's fascinating to me, and this has almost nothing to do with the book, is it seems like Sanderson is exploring or questioning his Mormon beliefs. If you don't know, Sanderson is a devout Mormon. I don't know if devout's the right word. Anyway, he's a card-carrying member of the Mormon Church, and he's also a self-described liberal member of the church, embracing the LGBT community, for example. And he's touched on LGBT characters before, but here in this book, he really highlighted what I thought was a pretty cool narrative. It almost feels like Sanderson is pushing the boundaries or questioning some of his Mormonisms. As another example, if you read some Mormon writers, they almost never use curse words. And maybe Sanderson has done this before, but for me, this is the first time I remember reading curse words in Sanderson's books, and there's even a discussion about cursing means. So that's why I say it was really interesting or fascinating to me, because it felt, again to me, like Sanderson was working through some things. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be completely wrong. I'm probably wrong, but let me know what you think down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.